Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and today I kind of just want to do a video where I talk a bit about rogues. And 8.2 hasn't had any kind of crazy changes happen to him so far. There was an awesome article I just looked at on Wowhead where a dude went down and broke down all the changes happened to Frost Death Knight. While there's not a lot of changes, he does dig deep into what is going to be affecting the spec. And while I would love to be in the same position as he is, talking about some of the newest changes that rogues are getting for 8.2, so far we have nothing. Blizzard is not nerfing us, but they are not buffing us. So in this video, I kind of just want to take a look at some of the things that I would change. It's going to be basic things like talents nobody ever really picks, maybe certain small changes for PvP, where I think the specs should go in the future, where they are great at and where they could be improved in, what could be buffed. But I'm not going to talk about anything that could be nerfed, just because I feel like rogues are, and it's going to sound biased, yes I know, we're in a pretty great spot right now. I guess there's a lot of things that you could nerf in order to make other specs better, but I feel like what Blizzard should do in that in first place, when it comes to other specs and comparing us to others, just simply buff the specs that are not performing as well. If there's other specs that are not doing as good as single target damage as we are, maybe it's worth taking a look at those classes and seeing how those could be buffed, rather than how can you downgrade rogues so that everybody else feels happier. Let's break down every single one of the specs. We're going to start with Assassination, into Outlaw, and then into Subtlety, simply because that's just how the specs appear in the list. And then we'll talk a bit about every single one of them. I'll tell you guys what I like, what I don't like, what could be changed, and it's going to be fairly brief. Now, Assassination has a lot of things you could change, but for the most part, it's a solid spec. The spec is basically the spec you want to play if you're not sure which rogue spec you want to play. Great sustain, great burst damage, fairly simple, and I won't say easy playstyle, but definitely straightforward compared to the other specs that have a little bit more nuance to them. First of all, let's take a look at the talents for the spec. There's a lot of cool talents in the game, and I really hope, like in the first row, for example, all three are great. Blindside, I want this talent to be stronger. There's a lot of traits right now for PvE in particular that play with Mutilate. Double Dose really makes us want to play into more Mutilates. And because this is the best trait for single target damage, you simply just have no room for Blindside. I feel like they need a bit more love to Blindside, either more procs for it, so then it feels a lot more fun, it feels in the global, but maybe slightly more damage. They recently did that in one of the patches, but it wasn't enough to bring Blindside forward, unless you're doing maybe some PvP, and even then Master Poisoner ends up being just far more powerful because it buffs your poisons, buffs you slow, and even buffs your wound poison, which is extremely useful. But Blindside simply just hasn't seen that much play. I would love to see this talent maybe proc more often, or do far more damage, or maybe even replace for something better. Maybe they should just make Blindside a baseline ability. I feel like, because it's such a fun ability to play, I think a lot of you can agree, Blindside is probably the more fun talent to work with, but the more practical ones right now are Elaborate Planning for PvE, Master Poisoner for PvP. At level 90 we see Venom Rush, which nobody really ever uses. Mutilate refunds 5 energy when used against a poison target. That means you gotta have poisons on an enemy, and it'll first spend the energy to use Mutilate, and then will refund it back. That doesn't make the ability cheaper, it simply refunds back energy. So if you're not playing Toxic Blade, which is a far stronger option for any build that has to do with poison damage, or Exsanguinate, which is a far stronger build if you're going for the bleed damage, you are not ever you are doing either one of those. They're simply just a stronger option. Venom Rush just is not competitive. Maybe replacing this talent would be a better option, or finding a ways to buff it. Maybe give you more energy regen, maybe all your finishers and all your abilities generate you back more resources, so that it could have some sort of play if you're kind of doing a half and half thing. Maybe half bleeds with your traits, half bleeds with your other traits, Elaborate Planning for that middle ground, and then Venom Rush. Venom Rush, if that applied for Blindside as well, I think could be really good too. I feel like they need to start adding a lot of these other traits to Blindside, maybe to make Blindside better. Level 100, Poison Bomb is great, Crimson Tempest is great, Hidden Blades is kind of weird. It has some specific uses, some very niche uses. Every 2 seconds you gain 20% increased damage to your next Phantom Knight, stacking up to 20 times. So after about, 40 seconds, you have a pretty beefy Phantom Knife that just does a fair amount of damage. I mean, it starts out with fairly low damage, but after the full stack, it's decent. The problem with that is you kind of have to wait for it to stack. In dungeons and raids, you really don't have too many uses for it. Maybe certain fights where you're just waiting for an opportunity where it's going to be brief AoE, or you're going to have a bunch of ads that die very, very quickly. I feel like there's a lot of other classes that could use that, so it feels kind of like a wasted talent slot for the most part. It has some use maybe with Night Stalker, so you can get that massive burst AoE damage on an unsuspecting group of enemies, but I don't really see a lot of uses for it. If this was more of a solid single target option that we could have maybe used, or maybe dealt increasingly a very high amount of burst AoE damage, maybe if it's stacked up faster, then I feel like it can be far more consistent, because you have like this bleed AoE, poison AoE slash single target, and then Hidden Blaze just doesn't really have that much of a great use. It does do fairly good amount of damage on train dummies, really, but it just, I don't really ever see it used. It's just, it doesn't compete in this row, and there's no traits to really make it work either. That's something that I think Blizzard could fix. Alright, moving on to the spec of Outlaw, and this is my main spec, so I can really talk about this one really free. Let's talk about Outlaw from talents. In the first row, it really just comes down to quick draw. I think they need to either buff Weapon Master, replace Weapon Master, do something with Ghost of Strike, like buff it maybe. Maybe take away its energy cost, maybe increase the damage it does, maybe increase the debuff it does, the duration maybe, so you can almost maintain uptime 24/7. Something to make this ability a little bit stronger. Weapon Master does give you Thunder Strike 10% more chance to strike, but that's just a percent chance. If you do get a chance to get a half off pistol shot, it is stronger, it gives more combo points, it simply just doesn't compete anymore. Ghost of Strike was really good back in Legion, you could maintain it basically the whole time. Now it has a 35-second cooldown, which is reduced by cooldown reduction for Outlaw. So as you spend combo points into finishers, be it Roll the Bones, your stun, your run through, it does shave off the cooldown for this ability as well. But it simply just doesn't maintain long enough for 10 seconds. And the spec is simply not a bursty spec, unless you get some crazy procs for PvE mostly, where you can really sink in that 10% damage and really make it worth. At level 90, it really comes down to alacrity. Loaded dice is just not that good. Loaded dice is not as good as the, how much haste is this? 10% extra haste is actually kind of nuts, because you don't really have to get the haste from your gear. So alacrity is just way too good. Loaded dice is simply not good enough. I feel like they need to either buff it so it doesn't work off of Adrenaline Rush, or maybe like you get some sort of a buff, or make it a separate buff that you can apply for yourself, so the next Roll the Bones is going to be a guarantee to buff or higher. Something where players can maybe control the buff mechanic. Maybe make it so that Loaded Dice replaces your Adrenaline Rush. Instead of Adrenaline Rush, you simply just get an ability. Your next Roll the Bones is a 5 buff. And you can play around that, make it a 5-minute cooldown. But Loaded Dice as it is right now is not good. Slice and Dice also could be buffed. There's a lot of different traits for Outlaw right now that maybe can work with Slice, but right now, Blizzard doesn't want you playing Slice. It is there if you want to play the easy version of Roll the Bones, but it is weaker. It is substantially weaker. What they said about it before, they want it to be a weaker, easier option that allows you to play how you want to play at a loss of damage. This is a pretty big damage loss. I think they need to buff it, or they need to remove it. Because if you're giving players its talent, this isn't something you can actually choose to. You basically are stuck with alacrity. You don't really get a choice. It's only just, it's a feint of choice. It only fools you into thinking you actually have a choice, or a meaningful choice. It really is like, you could do Slice and Dice if it's easier, but you should be playing alacrity. You could go Loaded Dice for certain situations, but alacrity simply ends up being the best. However, Outlaw Rogues do have a Azeroth trait that I feel like needs to be taken out and hopefully replaced. I really hope that going in the future, Blizzard does consider maybe adding or replacing certain Azeroth traits for specs, maybe certain Azeroth traits that nobody overtakes for any reason whatsoever. Paradise Lost is just not that great. Now, I know what you're thinking. Paradise Lost, take control of the Dice of Fate. You actually get control of your character. You don't really have to worry about Roll the Bones and the RNG. When you roll a 1 buff from Roll the Bones, you get agility. Maybe 3 of these with Slice and Dice could be really good, Dalaran. Let's find out. To prove my point, I hopped on PTR just so I can get myself all the different traits with Paradise Lost. I'm going to pair that together with Deadshot just to increase the consistency, because I'm so used to Deadshot. I thought maybe pair this with some of the randomized traits, but if it can perform fairly well with Deadshot, then it can probably be okay and stand all on its own. You're going to get a Blade Rush for that pure single target, Slice and Dice to make it happen, and that's really about it. And what I'm going to do is just go through my rotation on the train dummy. Do I have everything in order? PTR, that is the question. Let me get that Slice and Dice in there. And we are just going to try to get those between the eyes and pistol shots in there. You can see my damage on the bottom right. with the consistency. The amount of agility I'm getting right now is 800. That's not terrible amount, but there are definitely better traits in order to get that kind of agility. And for the most part, I'm using exactly the same gear that I normally would use when it comes to this type of damage. And the damage should be good on its own. There's not a lot I can really do. I can't really roll some kind of a crazy good buff. I can't really do anything about that, can I? All I can do is just consistently hit the train dummy that I'm looking at and try to do as much damage as possible. Because there's no buffs for me to roll to increase the damage that I should be outputting, there isn't a lot of room for me to gain the numbers that I'm losing. With Roll the Bones, sometimes you get bad rolls and then you kind of lose out on damage. When you get really good rolls, then you gain far more damage than you would lose out. Here I'm trying to get my pistol shots in there, but I don't have the cooldown reduction to get me more between the eyes so I can get my dead shots in. There's no real playstyle where I can get any kind of my cooldowns back faster. I'm not getting more auto attack speed. I'm having this passive 50%, passive energy regen. There's no fluctuation. I don't have the extra crit buff. Vanish ambush here to see if we can reset our damage a little bit. Oh, now we're actually pulling some decent numbers. Had to do a bit of a reset. Hold on. Big pistol shot, not the biggest pistol shot ever. And we're gonna slice and dice. But it's going back down to the 21k, back down to 20s. It had its honeymoon period and it looks like it's mostly over and done with. What I'm trying to say is I think Blizzard needs to do either better traits, and I really do hope they take a look at Paradise Lost again, either buff it by an incredible amount where you could potentially have a slice and dice build if you get triple Paradise Lost for incredible amounts of agility that you would gain to really make up for the lack of the variety of buff. You would still have a disadvantage in terms of just rolling slice and dice. Even if Slice and Dice dealt good damage, you don't have the cooldown reductions, you're not getting your abilities like Adrenaline Rush back quite as fast. But to kind of help offset it, if Paradise Lost at least gave you, I don't know, triple of these gives you 800 agility, I think it should give you about 1,200, maybe 1,500, anything to kind of make up that difference in damage. Because then you would allow players to actually play the playstyle of the Slice and Dice rotation. And if it's just easier and somewhat competitive, you still lose out in the in-depth portion of damage, because Blizzard doesn't really want you to play Slice and Dice as the main playstyle. They really want for most people to play the Roll the Bones, really. As for the rest of things with Outlaw, I feel like Outlaw is basically the Frost Mage of rogues, at least in PvP. While Assassination is the Fire Mage, you know, the popular spec that does just about anything you need it to. Decent CC, great damage, great burst, great potential to just about everything you do. As the Frost Mage still is a viable option. It just works in specific comps, and that's kind of how I feel where Outlaw Rogue is at. For PvP, it works in specific comps. We are in PvE and dungeons and raids the masters for AoE damage. They are nerfing one of our traits, which is Keep Your Wits About You. If I do have that anywhere. Keep Your Wits About You is somewhat nerfed, but not really. It now gains 5% trait, 5% stack for Keep Your Wits instead of 2% per target hit. So I think it's passive 5%, so it should slow down our AoE rotation a little bit. Let me try this out for myself actually, because I don't think it'll be that bad. So now I already have 35% chance. So you can still gain your stacks fairly high. You just won't be able to get them instantly when you're doing reaping. That's the only thing that really does change, is it tries to stop you from being able to gain those stacks instantly. Next spec on our list is gonna be Subtlety, the final spec that we will be taking a look at it, and this is the spec that I have had, I would say, the least amount of experience with. Not because it's a bad spec by any measure, but simply just because Subtlety is a fun spec, but with all the changes that Blizzard had for it in the negative direction, there was almost no reason to play it. But now it's really good in some areas. Not everywhere, but Subtlety definitely has room to grow. And I feel like with this patch 8.2, simply with the amount of gear and the fact that Subtlety always scaled well, it gives it potential to naturally grow without really any need for Blizzard intervention, as the spec itself has done in every expansion since, I think, ever that I've been playing, Cataclysm included. Cataclysm is where it really started for me. I would say that Subtlety always scaled the best out of all three specs. Let me go snag a bit of gear for Subtlety so I can showcase you guys it a little bit better with some of the traits. I'll be right back. Okay, so I was able to get my Subtlety Rogue back to exactly how I had him. I didn't do anything crazy or changed anything in terms of my traits. I really just wanted to get the same exact traits that I had in the past. So I'm back on my sub, and let's take a look at sub. This spec hasn't been that great for PvE. In PvP, it only recently got some great updates, but let's take a look at, first of all, the talents and kind of how we did it with the other specs. In the talent row for level 15, Weapon Master and Find Weakness both have a niche playstyle, mostly in PvE. Find Weakness ends up being a better choice for AoE, essentially, because you can Shadow Strike an enemy, and then you can use your Shuriken Storm to generate boatload of common points and really just crack through whatever target you decide to hit with Find Weakness. And as long as you can maintain a Shadow Strike once in a while, you can really funnel a lot of eviscerates into the enemy in dungeons and raids. Weapon Master is really good for that single target. Shadow Strike and Backstab have a 50% chance to hit again, which is you would think it would be insanely good for consistency. You know, let's say you're out of dance charges and you're backstabbing the enemy a lot. Extra common points would really go a long way. Gloomblade is really niche. It's not that good unless you have specific trait, which I actually have right here on my gear, Perforate. If you have 3 of those, you actually can play a weird play style, triple Perforate with Gloomblade, Shadow Focus, Vigor. I think this stays basically here. This is fine. Alacrity, which is weird, and Master Shadows, and you backstab all day. It gives you that consistent damage as long as you're able to backstab every single go. It plays a little bit better with haste, but mostly crit, less mastery, versatility to buff the damage of Gloomblade itself. And it's got a weird playstyle, and maybe we'll see that in the future. But it's just a weird thing that I want to point out to you guys. In level 100 row, this is where we get kind of weird. Secret Technique is supposed to be this cleave ability with a lot of damage, but it just simply, I feel like, is not worth. It doesn't do that much damage on its own. If you were to change up the way that Subtlety plays a little bit with all the AoE nerfs they had for it in recent patches, then maybe Secret Technique could really be good. Shuriken Tornado is really specific. I really like this one though. It's a really cool talent, and it has a really cool playstyle to it, and it works well with Find Weakness. So let's say I want to Shadow Strike an enemy, so I'll put Find Weakness on him, and I'll pop my I'll just let my tornado just go off. I'll just get a back-to-back eviscerates on one enemy. I can really just funnel this eviscerates back to back to back, and it's such a cool playstyle. A lot of rogues did that during Zul, where you could get massive amounts of AoE, but with Blizzard changing things around, I feel like this talent could, this whole row actually could do some facelift. This talent, I feel like, could be less cooldown, less energy, maybe even no energy cost, because you simply just can't abuse it like you used to. Secret Technique, I feel like, could do more damage to really make up for the lack of AoE that Subtlety has. Master Shadow is just fine as it is. Where the spec is at for PvE, where it really lost things, is when you lost your Shuriken combo. Shuriken combo was when your Shuriken Storm hit more than one enemy, you would gain a buff. So I hit one enemy, there's 3 extra, so I would get like a buff depending on how many enemies I hit. For common points generated, damage on my next eviscerate would be increased based on how many people I hit. And you can get it to fairly high numbers. So imagine rolling a Nightblade for 50% more damage. You got your Find Weakness in there for that Find Weakness rolling, and you get him back-to-back eviscerates onto one enemy while you fully beefed up a Subtlety. Sounds insane, sounds busted, right? Well, Subtlety was able to use that in order to pull, let's say, in a dungeon or raid setting, a bunch of little enemies and tell your team like, hey, don't hit them because I can do more single target damage if you guys just let them stay alive. They don't really hurt the tank, they don't really do anything, just don't pad the meters, just let me use them to build the insane amount of common points. That together with Deeper Strat, it will increase your damage of your eviscerate, because you're able to pull more common points into the eviscerates, damage is increased, and more common points being able to spend. You were able to output some crazy, awesome, and overall fun numbers. I really do want to say that that playstyle was extremely fun to play. Ever since Blizzard took away that trait, Subtlety just doesn't do any AoE. Yes, you still have the common point generation aspect to it, but when you had extra damage to funnel single target, it was far stronger, and the way that it is right now, it simply is not worth. Right now, where Subtlety is at for PvE, it has decent, okay-ish single target damage, but nowhere as impressive as the king of single target, the Assassination rogue. When it comes to AoE, Subtlety can kinda sorta pull off some numbers, but not as good as the king of AoE, the Outlaw rogue. Within the PvE confines of the game, the dungeons, the raids, maybe even the open world, between doing single target or AoE as a DPS class, you don't really have a lot of room. Yes, Subtlety can go in a dungeon and literally cheap shot, stun lock every single one of enemies. You can stun one guy into the next guy, into the next guy, stun the world if you wanted to. You could do that as a sub rogue. In how many areas would that be more useful? Most groups will say like, hey, just grab a monk for AoE stun or demon hunter for an AoE stun if you really want to stun everybody. So yes, while subtlety has that niche within PvE, it just doesn't get that much play, because realistically most people just look for the most amount of damage. The faster enemies die, the less you have to deal with them. But in PvP, this is where subtlety excels. In PvP, subtlety, crowd control has been absolutely fantastic between shadowy, dual, blind, multiple stabs that can come from shadow dances, cheap shots all day, kidney shots all day. Like, you could really just stun lock the whole enemy team, and it's fantastic. The spec definitely plays better for PvP. And with the recent buffs that they had, where they unnerfed the damage of your Shadow Strike for PvP, unnerfed the damage of your Eviscerate for PvP, and unnerfed your Mastery by a little bit, going from 33% nerf to 20% nerf, so like a 13% gain. Subtlety became a lot stronger for PvP. The burst damage is a little bit stronger. Sustain even feels just a little bit better with your Shadow Strike spamming the target. So the spec is doing great there. However, for subtlety, it is really hard to say what changes the spec really needs, because I could go on about all the things it needs, like, oh, all the things that got taken out, maybe put them back in, but I want to hold my horses, simply because of the way that subtlety is. Earlier, I mentioned something about subtlety being the best spec that scales. Subtlety, generally, the better the gear you get, the more damage it does. So while right now at like 414 with 420 pieces of gear, it doesn't do that much damage. In the brand new raid, wearing some of the brand new pieces of gear, it could potentially do far more damage. So the gear, the raw stats on the item levels of these items, that's mythic. We can even just take a look at heroic, which is 430 plus. Hell, even just normal, which is going to be the 415, which is where we are. Getting into that heroic and mythic level, jumping about 30 item levels is going to be huge. It's going to be pretty insane for the spec itself. So since subtlety always been a spec that scales better, sometimes I think it's always also a good idea to just simply wait and see. And with subtlety, before saying anything that I think should be buffed or nerfed, let's just see how the spec is going to be in the future. Although one thing I do think the Blitz should do is maybe take a look at some of the traits for subtlety. Knight's Vengeance doesn't seem to work the way it's supposed to. For example, it's supposed to work off of Night Blade increases the damage of an Eviscerate within 8 seconds by 603 per common point. But if I, let's say, get a bunch of common points, 603, it's your Eviscerate's still going to deal that passive 603 damage. So if I get full common points, I don't really get an incredible number that I'm supposed to be getting. I literally just do just slightly more damage. Certain traits just simply don't work. And that's really all I got when it comes to rogues and what I would go about changing. So there's obvious things where you can done with Assassination, Outlaw, and Subtlety. There's definitely talents that just don't really get that much play. So replacing those talents or buffing them to give them a bit more of a playstyle would be better. I do think that the current builds that everybody has right now, the cookie cutter build is fine and it works just okay. But to have more variety and more options between one build or the other, I feel like would definitely the community would enjoy. To be able to actually craft your build depending on situation, making certain talents that never generally picked far more useful, I feel like is never a bad thing. So if they can go about and try to see if they can even just tune the damage of those traits and talents to make them far more wanted, far more presentable, then I think it'll be great. As for what they will do with subtlety, I don't really know on PvE objectives. I think Assassination is still going to be the king of single target. Outlaw is still going to be the king of AoE, and subtlety is going to maybe have that niche fight. You really would need a fight where you could just funnel a lot of common points and things that just don't die and just... But even then, I don't really know if that would be better. Maybe playing a Outlaw where you can cleave to really beef up that single target damage would be stronger. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like when I say that Outlaw is the king of AoE, that means it's the king. Like, the other specs simply don't compete. You can try doing all the trades, but Outlaw is the path of least resistance. Same thing for Assassination, single target. Also, path of the least amount of resistance. So for subtlety, it just feels like you're having to try harder just to be average to the other specs. And if you were to just swap a spec, you would be able to try hard at that spec and achieve the ridiculous numbers that you would kind of hope for initially. But anyway, this is my thoughts. You guys let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you were to make any kind of changes for Subtlety, Assassination, or Outlaw for the patch 8.2, feel free to comment down below. Tell me what you guys think. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope to hear from you soon, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.